Thank you for joining me again today. And I'd like to share a few thoughts with you from the book of Job, chapter 19. Let me read just a few verses there, verse number 23 through 27. Job is saying here, "Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself. And mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me." I read of a man who was once being conducted by a guide over a very dangerous alpine trail. But they came to a particular place where there was a great rock that was jutting out over the precipice, and the trail was pretty well wiped out. Just a fragment of it left. And so the guide actually went there in front and laid hold on the rock and stretched his arm out over the precipice and encouraged his client, the traveler, to just step on his hand to get across or beyond the rock over to the trail on the other side. Well, you can imagine that the man was rather concerned about that prospect. He wasn't too sure that was a very wise move. And of course, he can see at least somewhat of the danger that's there over the precipice. And so as he hesitated and was just naturally afraid, his guide made this statement that I want to share with you today. "Do not fear to stand on my hand. That hand has never lost a man." Well, that guide may have all the confidence in the world, but it still might make it a little difficult to step on the hand if it were you or if it was me. But actually, if we can translate that a little bit to spiritual things, I would like to encourage you with this truth today. God's hand has never lost a man. God is still able to get us through the worst of storms. We may not know what all is going on. And Job, even here in this book and in this chapter, and in the surrounding chapters even, we may recognize that he was going through a rough place, and yet he had confidence that God would not fail him. We read chapter after chapter of the rebuke and the frustration, and yet through it all, Job did not forget that God was on his side. Much of his life had been turned upside down. You may feel a little bit like that even today. But one anchor remained firm in his life, and that was that God was on his throne. And could I just encourage you even today that God is still on his throne. We can have confidence in him. We can trust him. We know that he is able. You can look at verse number 25 there for just a little bit today. "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God." Notice we sometimes focus especially on "for I know that my Redeemer liveth," but he continues with and. And so there are three things that I'd like to share with you that we know that gives us sort of an anchor or a ballast in very difficult times. The first one we notice is just what he says there that we're so familiar with. "For I know that my Redeemer liveth." My Redeemer lives. He's there. He knows all about me. Job's trouble may have brought temptation even to question whether God was still there, or maybe at least that he cared. But somehow Job did not lose his way. There's several important words that you can find there. It's very simple, but you could just focus on those two words, "I know." If anybody would have questions about knowing, it ought to be Job. And yet he knew his confidence was not in his health, it wasn't in his circumstances, but he still knew God was there. The second part, the other two words, is "my Redeemer." Now, we don't know all that he had in mind. Maybe he was just thinking about his own redemption, restoration, and all those things. Or maybe he was even looking far out into the future and recognizing someday there's coming a Redeemer spiritually. The Messiah will be coming. But either way, he was proclaiming his trust in the God who would come through. The last one is the simple fact that he is still alive. My Redeemer liveth. Even though it may have seemed that God had forgotten him, or maybe it was just a figment of his imagination, or maybe he was already dead, or some other terrible thought, Job had confidence that his Redeemer was alive and well. He says, "I know." That's a fact. The second fact is he says, I know my Redeemer will overcome. He'll be triumphant. He is triumphant. He mentions there, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. So in other words, he's saying, I know God's going to be in charge all the way through until the end. This may not seem overly significant until we recognize that Job looked like a loser during these months. The months of suffering, the months of trial. Really, it may have seemed like if there really was a God out there, he wasn't strong enough for Job. Or else he didn't care. He wasn't big enough, whatever it was. Yet Job still held this truth close. God will stand over all someday. He'll set the record straight. He knows what's true. He knows what's right. I may not understand it all, but he does. He knows. You know, really, it can be boggling to our minds sometimes if we would just stop for a little bit and we start thinking about how maybe I'm feeling pretty good. Maybe things are going well in my life, but maybe it's just a few streets over or just across town or maybe in a nearby area. Maybe it's even further away, another state or something. But to recognize how much people are going through, even when I may not be feeling it. Maybe it seems okay to me. Maybe my life is going okay. And then sometimes it may even be reversed. And I'm feeling all the frustration and all the sorrow and all the hurt and pain. And then there's others around me that they don't have any idea what I'm going through. But when we're the ones hurting, it's good to know that God's not shaken by our heartache and our turmoil. Oh, he cares, but he's not shaken by it. He knows everything that we're dealing with. He's touched with my grief, but he's also triumphant over all. He knows every part of it. He will bring us through. Maybe even while you're watching this video or shortly afterward, you might even just do a quick little search of the song called Through. Just reminds us that sometimes when we thought God was going to deliver us and make all those things go away, sometimes he says, I want to take you through it. Through. We may not always see the bright side, but God will overcome. Thirdly, we might notice that we could recognize Job said, I know my Redeemer will show up. I know one day I will see him. The simple truth from verse number 26, he's saying here, even after my body's gone, I know that I will see God. God was not hampered with all the ailments and all the confusion that Job was dealing with. And he did show up later on. But actually in my Bible right here, I'm reading from the left column. If I go to the far right, I'm seeing why it's so significant. Because Job in chapter 23 verse number 8 says, Behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On the left hand where he doth work, but I cannot behold him. He hideth himself on the right hand, that I cannot see him. So on it's going where he's saying, I can't see God right now. But I know one day I will. I know that he sees me right now. Fact is, if you continue there, verse number 10 of chapter 23 says, But he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. Job knew that God knew where he was. And Job also knew, someday I'm going to see him. Someday it'll all be okay. He couldn't find God for a while. Must have been tormenting to him. But his faith said, I may not see God right now, but I will one day. A statement of continuing faith. And so today all of us face times of blessing and closeness with God. We love those times, don't we? But we also may all face hardship and suffering and confusion and uncertainty. We don't know everything, but maybe we need a fresh reminder that we can know some things. We can know that our Redeemer lives. We can know that he's going to overcome. And we can know also that he will show up for us. That assurance ought to help us get through the trials and the temptations and the heartache and all those things. And so today, and just bring it to a close, let me just remind you to keep your eyes on Jesus. Keep looking for him. He's still alive and well, and he will show up for you. You can have confidence in Jesus today. Praise his name.